Okay, we have our next presenter. Dr. Erin Tullos is the Director of Research and Development at Scientific Aviation, a subsidiary of ChampionX. Erin builds innovative methane emissions detection and reduction strategies at an industrial scale. Erin is visiting research fellow at the University of Texas at Austin, researching methane emissions and mitigation. Prior to her current roles, she worked in industry, including most recently at ExxonMobil, where previous responsibilities included research in emissions and environmental science, management of a portfolio of federal air regulations, and as a refinery environmental regulatory advisor. She holds a Bachelor of Arts and a PhD both in physical chemistry from Texas A&M University. ChampionX is a global leader in providing chemistry programs and services, drilling technology, artificial lift solutions, and automation technologies for the upstream and midstream oil and gas industry. Our world-class safety culture fuels our purpose to improve lives through our commitment to deliver sustainable operations. So Erin's going to be presenting virtual. So let me know in the back if you can hear her when she starts. Okay, go ahead, Erin.
Thanks so much. I'm very sad that I can't be with you all in person. I had intended to do so and had a silly accident with some sharp glass that my children say I should tell people was really an interaction with ninjas. So one of the downsides of not being in the room is I can't tell if any of my jokes land, so I'll try and keep them to the minimum.
We will laugh loud.
Okay, perfect. I hope you have an applause sign so they know when it's appropriate. So I'm here really today wearing a different hat, one as a consultant to the United Nations Environment Program, who runs the Oil and Gas Methane Partnership 2.0, or sometimes called the OGMP 2.0. And so recently I heard someone refer to the gas certification and differentiation space as an alphabet soup, and that resonated with me because it can be an environment that's really difficult to navigate and understand what appear to be slight differences between different approaches that operators might sign on to demonstrate their progress in a credible way toward emission reduction. And so today I'm going to focus only on the Oil and Gas Methane Partnership, but glad to take questions about how that fits into a greater context. The Oil and Gas Methane Partnership 2.0 stands out in my mind because it's not a green initiative per se. It's really a partnership, a coalition of the willing to accelerate action. This is a partnership of companies, 77 companies and growing, of partners that are rolling up their sleeves and establishing the how to progress methane emissions mitigation informed by a measurement-based inventory, and then doing it on an accelerated timeline. So as we know, the world is not on track to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees as outlined in the Paris Agreement. And we see in a variety of different reports, in the UNEP emissions gap report, or even in the more recently published IPCC report, that we still have a lot of work to do. And so this is an issue that I believe is near and dear to the hearts of everyone sitting in the room. We're an environmental community that comes together to find common sense solutions to get the right cost-effective actions into place. But as you all know, we manage what we measure. And so getting those cost-effective actions into place really comes down to fully understanding and appreciating the sources of emissions. The recently published IPCC mitigation report points out that deep greenhouse gas reductions are needed by 2030 and 2040, and particularly methane, highlighting, as many others have, that methane emissions reductions is mission critical to the short term to stave off the most significant peak warming. Of course, this was prominently highlighted as well in the fall during COP26, where 110 companies joined the Global Methane Pledge, and 70% of GDP was covered by the signatories, which all agreed to a 30% methane reduction target by 2030. However, we know through academic studies and geostudies and studies that operators have taken on themselves, Our current emission factor-based inventory approach in the US and even less sophisticated approaches we find on a global basis at large don't fully represent what's observed by measurement. And so closing that gap to make sure that we're putting the resources cost effectively to the most impactful methane reductions is paramount. And I think that's what was top of mind when the joint European and US press release pointed at the International Methane Emission Inventory as playing an important role in delivering the global methane pledge. The International Methane Emissions Inventory was launched at the G20 summit, and it's a data-driven, action-focused initiative by the United Nations Environment Program with support from the European Commission to catalyze dramatic reduction of methane emissions reductions, starting with the energy sector. And again, it comes down to because we manage what we measure. So the International Methane Emissions Observatory is really a data stacking, if you will, that brings together different spatial and temporal data sources and helps reconcile one to the other. So the first step in the International Methane Emission Inventory is to receive data. That data will come in from the Oil and Gas Methane Partnership annual reporting reports, and I'll talk about those more in a moment when I dive deeper into the OGMP. It also includes science measurements and national inventories and satellite data. These are all brought together in a massive data fusion where data scientists will apply, and here truly in my mind is an alphabet soup, all the big data and the data science and the machine learning and all of those tools that are far outside of my field, and identify and reconcile the inconsistencies, find the gaps, feed back to what additional measurements are necessary, and generate global products that can fully inform next steps in terms of global methane emissions reductions. So the types of products that are envisioned to be developed by the International Methane Emissions Inventory include, full methane emission data sets, annual reports, direct measurement studies, science-based implementation. And the idea here is there are quite a number of companies, many of you are very likely sitting in the room, that are already doing quite a lot to better understand your emissions, to characterize them, to reduce them, to measure them. But companies are largely doing this individually, and to accelerate action at the scale that's necessary, we'll have to come together and pool that learning in a centralized location. And the International Methane Emission Inventory seeks to step into that gap. As I mentioned a moment ago, one of the most important pieces of information comes from the Oil and Gas Methane Partnership reports. So at its core, what is OGMP 2.0? It's a framework by which partners establish how they will credibly report measurement-informed emissions inventory into a centralized location. So it provides a comprehensive measurement-based reporting framework that covers the upstream, the midstream, and the downstream segments, global coverage and scope. It's public, it's private, it's national oil companies. In fact, the assets already represent greater than 50% of global oil and gas production in over 60 countries today. You can see just a quick snapshot of some of the diversity of the membership companies and some of the partners involved. And my favorite, this global map depiction of the coverage we have for participation from assets literally across the world. The OGMP 2.0 is often called the gold standard of methane reporting. That's because it's the only comprehensive measurement-based reporting framework for the oil and gas industry today. It's not a certification. And what I mean by that is certifications often have an output, and I'm not sure if Laura was speaking before me or after me, so not to jump too far ahead, but certification seeks to enable monetization of these reductions. And in this case, it's just a measurement and reporting framework on which an operator could choose to lay a certification program or not. So it's not really an either or, it's a how do we move to a measurement-based approach. Member companies report on all their material sources from both their operated and non-operated assets from all segments of the value chain. Excluded are things like gas stations or petrochemical refining, but otherwise, a company that has upstream, midstream assets, everything, when a company signs up to be a member of the partnership, everything is included. There's no selection of one or two well sites, no selection of our best performing assets. It's not based on a particular location. It's a full in demonstrated commitment to report on a measurement basis under a credible and standardized framework. And therefore, the OGMP 2.0 provides assurance that member companies reaching the gold standard, which I'll describe in a moment, are managing their emissions responsibly because it's occurring on a measurement basis with a target in mind that's tracked over time. The European methane strategy described it as the best existing vehicle for improving measurement, reporting, and verification capability in the energy sector. And accordingly, we saw the OGMP 2.0 serve as the basis for the Commission's methane regulation just this past December. Inherently within the OGMP 2.0, I talk about measurement-based reporting, and lots of people have ideas about what that looks like. But essentially, we've laid out the framework in 5 levels. The first is venture and asset reporting, and the second is based upon emissions categories. These aren't especially interesting to talk about in the United States context because the United States Greenhouse Gas Reporting Program already obligates those with reporting requirements to report at level 3, which is what you'd be most familiar with when you think about GHGRP data as generic emissions sourced by level. And so what we mean there is emissions detailed by source type, but based on generic emission factors. So 13.5 standard cubic feet per hour for every hour of service of each intermittent pneumatic controller, as an example of what I mean by generic emission factor. What the OGMP 2.0 reporting framework challenges operators to do is to move beyond these generic emission factors. And we all know intuitively that that's necessary. We know that we like generic emission factors because they're a consistent basis and one that we're all familiar with, and many of us have already operationalized within the context of our companies. We know that they have their strengths, and they do. And the purpose for which they're generated was historically to build up a national emission inventory. And so on a national average basis, it's a really good approach. But what we all intuitively also know is that these methods don't describe an individual asset or piece of equipment well, particularly when you go to compare 2 really similar assets or pieces of equipment. And so the OGMP 2.0 reporting level 4 moves to continue to appreciate the necessity of source level inventories to inform mitigation strategies, but introduces measurement and more detailed source and asset specific methodologies and activity factors to describe source level emissions for individual assets. My earliest days, oh gosh, there was a time a decade ago, I would have said a few years ago, but moving past that, my earliest days, I recall one of my first assignments was to look at a drive-by type measurement of a refinery that was then compared to the refinery emission inventory. And the discussion was, how do you compare a national, an annual emission factor-based inventory to a snapshot measurement? Well, that measurement took place over the course of 1 minute, 3 minutes, 2 hours. It certainly wasn't 8,760 minutes or hours rather. And so really thinking about how to make that comparison becomes challenged. And so we know that we need something more granular to understand the spatial and temporal variation of emissions from real sources out in the field. That being said, there's still a great opportunity to miss sources in their entirety. And so moving from generic emission factors at level 3 to specific emission factors that are applicable to your particular asset Level 5, which we call the gold standard, incorporates a site level measurement that has been reconciled back to that source level inventory. And what this ensures is that we have the right answer in terms of total emissions, but also for the right reasons. In other words, we're able to attribute the emissions to the sources that they came from. And once we know that we have the right number for the right reasons, we can both inform our mitigation strategies in a way that we deploy capital smartly to get the biggest bang for our buck, but we can also credibly report to the public our total emissions and those emissions that we managed to reduce. Member companies within the OGMP 2.0 have their work cut out for them, undoubtedly, but coming together, sharing knowledge, and developing protocols through the sweat equity of the companies themselves, as well as the consulting staff at the United Nations and supporting organizations, there's an aggressive timeline to start doing this work. And so the OGMP member companies, many of which who joined in 2019, join, and that's considered year 0. By year 1, it's expected the companies will submit their first report, which doesn't have to be at level 4 and level 5. It can be at any number of levels, but the companies start building their muscle of reporting, and they'll also submit an implementation plan with a credible pathway to achieve the gold standard for all operated assets by year 3 and all non-operated assets by year 5. OGMP requirements are simple. An operator defines and discloses a 2025 methane reduction target. They submit the implementation plan I just mentioned to demonstrate their pathway. And this is a living document. It can be revised and changed year over year, but they need to have pen to paper, credible pathway to achieve the gold standard by 3 years for operated assets and 5 years for non-operated assets. And then report annually against those targets on their methane emissions, again, from both their operated and non-operated assets. Publicly reported data is not all of the information we receive at the United Nations from the companies. It's limited in scope to what I've shown here: the declared methane reduction target, the total emissions, and progress toward the targets. And it's in a simple company fact sheet. We've already put out our first report, so you can check out that fact sheet. The confidential asset level data or country level emissions data is not publicly disclosed, but is used in an anonymized and aggregated basis within the International Methane Emission Inventory, or Observatory, coming back to the start of this talk. Companies are expected to have aggressive targets. Individual targets for each company to be reported on and should be ratcheted with time. Again, vary at the discretion of the company. These targets can either be intensity based or an absolute target. To be aligned with the Paris goals, we recommend that we know industry as a whole needs to meet the targets here, and so we recommend each company target something similar. So at least 45% reduction in terms of absolute emissions by 2025 and 60 to 75% by 2030, or a near zero emissions intensity target. We often point to OGCI when we talk about what does it mean to be near zero. And at the time we started saying that, the intensity target in that instance was 0.25%. Of interest to many companies is that while we define in our measurement reporting framework the principles and rigor with which operators should endeavor to report at levels 4 and 5 their methane emissions, or the numerator of that intensity, we do not a priori prescribe the denominator, appreciating that methane intensity, where we talk about things like methane emissions divided by gas to market, is biased in favor of dry gas operations as opposed to oily production facilities. And so we have the flexibility to allow an operator to define the denominator or the target that makes sense for them. We're really focused on getting a measurement-based methane emission rate from the portfolio in its entirety. Targets for non-operated assets are not required, but desirable. The OGMP 2.0 consultants and technical work groups are busy working on a variety of technical guidance documents. Many are still a work in progress. One of the advantages to joining the OGMP and being part of that partnership is to be able to bring to bear your experiences in measurement and helping accelerate actions by allowing the rest of the world to benefit from the deep experience you probably have, and influence the way that we collectively and globally believe that emissions should be measured and reported. And so technical guidance documents are source specific to help inform level 3 reporting. Lots of countries, thinking about this in a global context, are still reporting at a level 1, maybe a level 2, and so they don't have the benefit of the years of experience that we enjoy in the United States of the greenhouse gas reporting program, and instead are reliant upon new documents and tools to help create even a first granular generic emission factor based inventory. So we work on these technical guidance documents. They also have considerations for how to progress that measurement strategy. Maybe, what's near and dear to the hearts of many that I hear from is the technical guidance documents that help describe reconciliation and uncertainty, which is a guidance document that is currently going through the approval process. The United Nations works under a consensus-based approval. So if you've ever been in a team meeting, you'll know how incredibly difficult it can be to get a bunch of engineers and scientists to come to a consensus on a technical point, even a simple one. So you can imagine that with 77 member companies, UN staff, and other partners, it can be quite challenging to develop technical guidance documents on a consensus basis. Nevertheless, we have had quite a bit of success in building out documents. The bolded ones shown here are already publicly available and available on the OGMP 2.0 website. And we have high hopes that the reconciliation and uncertainty guidance document will be publicly available very soon as well. I often get the question about accessing these documents. Once they've been approved, they are generally and publicly available. Prior to approval, they are never available. And the reason is that member companies feel very strongly that others that have not subscribed and signed up to do the work of the rigorous reporting shouldn't have a say in how those that are going to do the reporting should do it. And so it is I say closed process, but how closed is it really when 77 companies and stakeholders have a say in it? It's still a diverse set of stakeholders indeed, but it is not generally publicly available until approval for that reason. I already started to touch on some of the benefits of joining the OGMP. You, as a company, can demonstrate your commitment to the Paris Agreement and the Global Methane Pledge. We know that quite a number of organizations and governments are interested in this approach. OGMP members have the benefit of the wisdom of the collective by participating as stakeholders and in our technical guidance groups and the like. We have mirror groups that are industry only fora for companies to discuss their challenges, concerns, successes, and the like in a safe space. And so the acceleration in my view really comes from having this partnership and a common learning. And members get to represent the industry's voice at the International Methane Emissions Observatory, which will quickly become the global repository for the most comprehensive methane emissions data in the world. I've touched already on the knowledge and experience and sharing benefits, and importantly, teaming with other companies on these complex documents. There's flexibility. We know that there's no one-size-fits-all solution from a technology perspective. We also know that there's no way a handful of us could put in a concise document measurement protocols for everyone, everywhere, for every type of asset. And so instead we build in flexibility and are principles based. We have a phased approach that recognizes it'll be easier to implement things on operated assets relative to unoperated assets. If companies don't manage to receive their non-operated joint venture data, as long as reasonable efforts are demonstrated, they'll still keep their gold standard. Even if a company doesn't achieve the gold standard, their membership is retained. There's, very little stick other than, not having the designation of gold standard, but the benefits continue to exist for all members. It doesn't cost any money. Companies are encouraged to focus on the most material sources of emissions. I hear often, we don't care about measurement that much, we care about mitigation. And we would say, yes, and you don't know how effective your mitigation is or how to effectively deploy your capital if you don't know what your emissions are. The governance of the organization is housed under a steering group where there's one member for every company and non-company in the steering group. It's the formal governing body. It meets a couple of times a year. They're supported by 3 technical task forces, one that works on the technical guidance documents for the sources, one that works on the reporting protocols, and the other that works on the uncertainty and reconciliation. I lead that task force. This is a smaller group of participation, but all companies engage through mirror groups. The mirror groups, one for the upstream and one for the mid and downstream, again, are industry-only groups that meet and engage at a technical level a couple times a month and are pooling their technical input to their technical representatives to go back to the task force. And it's a safe space, if you will, for companies only. UNEP is not involved, EDF is not involved, the commission is not involved, etc. And then finally, how to join. It's free. Companies sign a memorandum of understanding to express their commitment to the OGMP 2.0 reporting framework. Once companies have signed the MOU, it's also signed by United Nations. And then the companies are invited to the steering group and to the mirror groups and engaged in the process after an introductory call. So thank you. I don't know the best way to take questions through this.
Yeah, I can help facilitate that.
Fabulous. Thank you.
Do we have any